When I first heard someone say India and China are growing closer and it's making Trump angry, I thought to myself, there's a lesson here far deeper than politics, far greater than just two nations or one man's reaction. It's a story about power, about fear, about unity, and about what happens when people begin to write their own narrative instead of letting others define it. And I want to invite you today not just to listen, but to feel the heartbeat of this moment, because it has something to teach all of us about our own lives. You see, for decades, the world has been told who should lead, who should dominate, and who should fall in line. But the friendship between India and China, two of the most powerful, ancient, and visionary civilizations, is more than a headline, it's a signal that cooperation can sometimes speak louder than competition. That collaboration can shake the ground beneath those who are used to being on top. And when I hear that it makes someone like Trump angry, I don't just hear anger. I hear fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being left behind, fear that the old order is giving way to a new one. But let me tell you something about fear. It is not the enemy. Fear is a mirror. It shows us what we're most afraid to lose, and sometimes it reveals what we never really had. And if we look at this through that lens, we see a powerful lesson. When others are afraid of your growth, it's because your growth is real. When others are rattled by your friendship, it's because your unity has weight. Now think about this for yourself. How many times in your own life have people gotten uncomfortable when you began to rise? How many times have your friendships, your partnerships, your dreams made someone else uneasy? Not because you were wrong, but because you were stepping into your own power. India and China's friendship is not just about two nations. It is a mirror for us. It reminds us that strength does not always have to be loud. It does not always have to be aggressive. Sometimes it is simply in the choice to stand together when the world expects you to stand apart. And so, yes, it may make some angry. It may unsettle those who cling to control. But that is the cost of change. That is the price of progress. If you want to grow, if you want to transform, if you want to rise, you must be willing to make someone uncomfortable. And here's the hook, you are not here to please everybody. India and China are not here to please Trump. And you, my friends, are not here to dim your light so someone else can feel comfortable in their shadow. When we look at the growing partnership between India and China, it is impossible to ignore the fact that this is not just about two countries shaking hands across a table. This is about a strategic alignment that represents a dramatic shift in global power. For decades, the balance of power in Asia and in much of the world has been tilted in favor of the United States and its allies. Washington was seen as the unavoidable center of influence, the one whose nod or disapproval could alter the direction of global politics. But now, what we are witnessing between India and China is the emergence of a new reality. Two of the world's most populous nations, with vast economies and ancient civilizations behind them, are learning that standing together may give them more weight than standing apart. And this is the very thing that unsettles those used to dominance. Consider the scale of what is happening here. India, with its rapidly expanding economy, its young and dynamic workforce, and its growing technological capabilities, is not just a regional player, it is becoming a global one. China, with its established manufacturing dominance, its Belt and Road Initiative, and its ambitions to reshape international finance, already stands as a powerhouse that challenges the old order. When these two forces move closer, even if only in specific areas like trade, infrastructure, or diplomacy, the sheer weight of their combined influence begins to bend the arc of global politics. This is not a subtle shift, it is seismic. And those who have long relied on being the single voice of authority now find themselves dealing with an alliance too big to dismiss. The United States, particularly under leaders like Donald Trump, has thrived on a strategy of division. divide nations, weaken potential alliances, and step in as the broker of power. That has been the formula. But the friendship taking shape between India and China is a direct challenge to that approach. It disrupts the narrative that these two countries must always be rivals, that their disputes are too deep to bridge. Instead, it offers a glimpse of what can happen when nations prioritize long-term vision over short-term disagreements. And here's the hook: when rivals learn to cooperate, they become far stronger than enemies who fight. That is what makes this friendship not just symbolic, but truly transformative. Think about it for a moment. What does it mean for the world when nearly 40% of the global population, represented by India and China, begins to lean toward partnership? It means trade routes may shift, markets may diversify, and international institutions may be forced to listen to voices they once overlooked. It means policies set in Washington or Brussels are no longer the only ones that matter. It means the future may be decided in New Delhi and Beijing just as much as it has been in Washington or London. And that is why this growing friendship signals a power shift that cannot be ignored. Of course, this does not mean India and China will suddenly erase all their disputes. Their history is complicated, their borders contested, their interests often in competition. But therein lies another powerful lesson. Strategic partnership does not demand perfection, it demands pragmatism. The very act of working together, despite differences, sends a strong signal to the rest of the world. Unity can be chosen even where conflict has long been the default. And if two rivals like India and China can find common ground, what excuse do others have to cling to division? Trump's anger, then, is not really about one handshake or one meeting. It is about the realization that the old order is slipping away, that America's monopoly on global influence is being tested by the rise of a partnership too significant to ignore. And if we zoom out, the story becomes even bigger. It is not just about politics, it is about a changing world. A world where collaboration may become the new power, where friendship can be as disruptive as conflict, and where those who once ruled by dominance must now learn the language of cooperation. That is why this moment matters. It is not just a story of India and China. It is a lesson for us all about what true power looks like when it begins to shift. Donald Trump's frustration with the growing warmth between India and China is not just a matter of political rivalry. It is a reflection of deeper anxieties within Washington's power structure. For years, the United States has positioned itself as the central player in Asian affairs, often attempting to balance relationships, stir divisions, and maintain its status as the ultimate arbiter in the region. But when two of the largest nations in Asia begin to cooperate, even in limited ways, it shakes the foundation of that control. Trump's anger becomes more than a personal response. It is a symbol of how the United States feels when the script it has written for others is no longer being followed. And that anger, in many ways, reveals far more than silence ever could. What makes Trump particularly uneasy is the unpredictability of this new dynamic. India and China have historically stood on opposite sides of regional disputes, and Washington has often counted on those tensions as a way to keep Asia fragmented and dependent on U.S. oversight. By presenting itself as the friend of India, the U.S. sought to balance against China's rise. But when those old fault lines begin to close, even temporarily, the strategy of division starts to collapse. Trump's frustration is not about one event or one meeting. It is about the loss of a playbook that has long worked in America's favor. The hook here is simple. When the game changes and you no longer hold the rules, anger is often the first reaction. Trump built much of his political brand on projecting strength, dominance, and the ability to win on the global stage. Yet in this case, his reaction betrays weakness. It shows that even the most powerful office in the world cannot always dictate the choices of independent nations. And when those choices favor cooperation between two giants, It signals that the world may be shifting beyond America's tight grip to a leader like Trump who thrives on control and negotiation through leverage. Such shifts feel like personal affronts, but what they really are is a natural outcome of nations recognizing their own power and seeking to maximize it without waiting for approval. For India, leaning into a friendship with China does not mean abandoning ties with the West, but it does mean asserting independence. For China, it means proving that it can build bridges even with long-standing rivals. Together, this alignment tells the world that Asia is no longer content to be managed by outside powers. And here lies the deeper truth. Trump's frustration is not just about losing influence, it is about losing the illusion of inevitability. The United States has long assumed its place at the center of global affairs was secure, but the sight of India and China stepping forward side by side threatens that assumption in a way that words alone cannot. Think of it like a chessboard. For years, America has believed it was always playing with the strongest pieces, able to corner opponents through strategy and pressure. But when two players who were once focused on outmaneuvering each other decide instead to move together, the board changes. Suddenly, the king is not as safe, the queen not as powerful, and the game not as predictable. That's the hook. Cooperation between rivals can sometimes cause more disruption than conflict ever could. And it is that disruption that has left Trump unsettled, because it signals that the world no longer revolves around the moves he expects others to make. Trump's anger, then, is not simply emotional. It is instructive. It tells us that power is shifting, that alliances once thought impossible are now shaping reality, and that the United States cannot control every outcome. More importantly, it teaches us something about growth itself. When people or nations begin to choose their own path, those who were used to holding the reins will always feel threatened. The question is not why Trump is angry, but why anyone would expect him not to be. Because when two of the world's largest powers begin to lean toward friendship, anger from those who fear losing control is not just predictable, it is inevitable. When we talk about India and China finding common ground economically, the stakes are far bigger than trade figures on paper. What unsettles Washington most, and especially Trump, is the possibility that this collaboration could directly threaten America's grip on global commerce. For decades, the U.S. has enjoyed leverage because so many economies depended on its markets, its currency, and its technology. But when two of the fastest growing economies on the planet begin to carve out a system that does not orbit around America, the old balance begins to collapse. This is not a small shift. This is the kind of adjustment that can reorder the way global trade operates. And that is exactly why Trump's frustration runs so deep. Imagine the combined weight of India's tech innovation and China's manufacturing strength. One brings a surge of talent, software, and digital infrastructure, while the other offers scale, logistics, and production capacity unmatched anywhere else. Separately, they are powerful. Together, they are formidable. If they expand trade agreements, collaborate on supply chains, or create alternative platforms for commerce, they can reduce their reliance on U.S. markets. And once that dependency shrinks, the U.S. loses one of its most effective tools of control, economic pressure. The hook is undeniable. When others stop needing you, your power starts fading no matter how loudly you insist otherwise. For Trump, who measures success in deals, deficits, and trade wars, this is not just an abstract threat. It cuts at the heart of his political identity. He built his image on the promise of protecting American jobs and keeping U.S. industry strong, often by taking hardline stances against foreign competition. But when India and China explore partnerships that could sidestep U.S. tariffs, reduce dollar-based trade, or develop regional financial systems, it undermines the very leverage Trump has tried to wield. Every time they sign a new agreement or signal deeper economic ties, it chips away at the credibility of America's dominance in trade negotiations. Consider the possibility of alternative payment systems, for example. If India and China push toward trading more in their own currencies or in a shared digital framework, it challenges the supremacy of the US dollar. And once the dollar begins losing its status as the unquestioned currency of global exchange, America's ability to print influence weakens dramatically. That is not just an economic shift, it is a geopolitical earthquake. And this is the scenario that Trump and many in Washington fear the most, a world where America's financial strength is no longer the default, but just one option among many. And yet, what makes this moment even more disruptive is that economic collaboration does not have to be perfect to be powerful. India and China do not need to agree on every detail to unsettle global trade. The simple act of choosing to do more business together sends a strong signal to other nations. There are alternatives, and they are growing. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe may begin to diversify their trade relationships, reducing their reliance on U.S. markets. Suddenly, America is no longer the indispensable hub. It is simply one player among several. And here's the hook. Once you prove to the world that there is another way, the monopoly of influence begins to crack, no matter how strong it once appeared. Trump's frustration, therefore, is rooted in more than just anger at being sidelined. It is a recognition that the very structure of global trade, which has long favored the United States, is being rewritten without American permission. And when nations like India and China take steps to free themselves from economic dependence, it does not just weaken America's bargaining position, it redefines the rules of the game. The U.S. can no longer dictate terms in the same way because the leverage it once held is slipping away with every new partnership forged outside its orbit. What makes this moment historic is the courage of two nations to put aside old rivalries in pursuit of economic strength. Cooperation in this form is more than strategy. It is survival and it is vision. And it serves as a reminder to the world that real power often lies not in domination, but in collaboration. That is why this story is about much more than trade statistics. It is about a changing order, one that makes Trump's anger look less like strength and more like fear of what happens when the ground beneath him starts to shift. The symbolism of India and China standing together, even tentatively, carries a weight that extends far beyond economics or diplomacy. For decades, the global community has viewed these two nations through the lens of rivalry, neighbors with clashing borders, competing interests, and starkly different political models. The assumption was always that their disagreements were too deep, their distrust too ingrained, to allow for anything more than cautious dialogue. Yet, when they appear willing to cooperate, even in small steps, the signal to the world is striking. If two long-time rivals can find common ground, then perhaps the boundaries of what is possible in global politics are far wider than we have been led to believe. That shift in perception alone is powerful enough to unsettle those who rely on division as a source of control. Symbolism matters in politics because it shapes narratives, and narratives shape power. When India and China sit at the same table, the message is not just about trade deals or border discussions. It is about rewriting the story others have told for decades. The West, particularly the United States, has leaned heavily on the assumption that Asia's largest powers will remain divided and therefore dependent on external mediation. Trump's anger in this context becomes clearer. If India and China are no longer locked in opposition, then America loses one of its most effective justifications for interfering in the region. The hook here is that cooperation between rivals doesn't just change relationships, it changes the balance of who gets to define the story. Think about the psychological impact of such unity for smaller nations across Asia, Africa, and beyond. Seeing India and China together provides a sense of reassurance that alternatives to Western alignment exist. It shows that regional strength can emerge from within, without constant reliance on external powers. This, in itself, is a form of soft power that America cannot easily counter. The very image of Indian and Chinese leaders shaking hands resonates globally, not because it erases their differences, but because it represents the possibility of setting those differences aside in pursuit of something bigger. And that image is far more threatening to the established order than any policy paper or tariff ever could be. The United States has long thrived on symbolic dominance. The American flag planted on the moon, the handshake between U.S. presidents and foreign leaders, the televised speeches declaring America's role as the leader of the free world. These images have shaped global perception for generations. But now, when cameras capture India and China stepping toward collaboration, it begins to erode that symbolic monopoly. Suddenly, the most compelling image is not of Washington dictating terms, but of two Asian powers redefining them. And here's the hook. When you lose control of the narrative, you begin to lose control of the reality that follows. It is also important to understand that symbolism is not empty. It has practical consequences. When two rivals demonstrate a willingness to work together, even temporarily, it reduces the likelihood of conflict, which in turn alters military calculations, trade routes, and diplomatic alliances. Nations that once hesitated to invest in the region may feel more confident. Others who were waiting to see if cooperation was possible may decide to follow suit. The ripple effect of symbolic unity often becomes tangible change, and that is precisely why Trump and others in Washington view it as dangerous. They understand that once an image takes root, it becomes difficult to erase. What makes this even more significant is the way it challenges the old narrative of inevitability. For years, analysts have insisted that India and China are destined to remain adversaries locked in a cycle of mistrust. But when they demonstrate that cooperation is possible, however fragile, it undermines the fatalism of that story. It opens the door to new possibilities. And with those possibilities comes the potential to shift alliances, trade networks, and power structures. And this is the lesson buried in the symbolism. Sometimes the act of choosing peace, even temporarily, is more disruptive to the status quo than conflict itself. When Trump grows angry at the sight of India and China standing together, it is not simply about the practical consequences of their cooperation. It is about the symbolic blow to America's narrative of indispensability. For decades, the story was that Washington was the necessary mediator, the essential partner, the only reliable force to balance Asia. But the image of India and China shaking hands, even with unresolved disputes, says otherwise. It tells the world that nations can decide their own path without waiting for America's approval. And that image, powerful and undeniable, is enough to shift the very ground on which global politics has long stood. Trump's reaction to the growing friendship between India and China highlights a deeper fear within Washington, the fear that a new world order is beginning to emerge, one where the United States is no longer the uncontested center of power. For more than 7 decades, America has enjoyed a dominant role in global politics, shaping institutions, setting the rules of trade, and influencing the direction of international relations. But the closer India and China move toward cooperation, the more that dominance looks fragile. What makes this moment so unsettling for Trump and those who think like him is not simply that two countries are building ties. It is that these two particular countries, representing nearly half of humanity, have the potential to rewrite the rules of the global system altogether. When we speak of a new world order, it is not about an overnight revolution, but rather a slow shift of gravity. Power is no longer flowing exclusively westward. It is tilting toward Asia. The 20th century was shaped by American economic strength, military presence, and cultural influence. But the 21st century is being reshaped by rising economies, new technologies, and the assertiveness of nations unwilling to remain in the shadow of Western dominance. India and China embody this change. One offers a young, ambitious population with explosive growth in technology and services, while the other commands manufacturing might and long-term strategic vision. Together, they symbolize the possibility of a multipolar world where no single country dictates the terms for everyone else. That vision alone is enough to unsettle those who cling to the past. Trump's anger, therefore, is not just a personal outburst. It is a reaction to an existential challenge to America's supremacy. His brand of politics thrives on the idea of America first, America strongest, America unchallenged. But the friendship between India and China undermines that narrative because it suggests that nations can build strength without America's blessing and sometimes even in defiance of its preferences. The hook is sharp here. The more others grow together, the less America's dominance matters and the angrier its leaders will become. What makes this fear even more pronounced is the scale of possibility. If India and China expand cooperation beyond economics into regional security, technology standards, or global governance, the institutions that America helped build could be reshaped. The United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and even the financial systems that rely on the US dollar could face challenges from parallel structures born in Asia. Trump understands that once alternatives exist, the monopoly of power is broken, and history shows us that once a monopoly breaks, it rarely returns. That is the hook that explains his frustration, because behind the bluster lies the recognition that power, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. The irony, of course, is that Trump himself often championed disruption, but only when it worked in America's favor. He praised the idea of breaking old systems, renegotiating deals, and dismantling global frameworks. Yet, when others begin to disrupt the very dominance America relies on, the rhetoric changes. Disruption is no longer innovation, it is a threat. Cooperation among others suddenly becomes betrayal. This contradiction reveals the insecurity at the core of America's global posture. Confidence on the surface, but a deep fear that the age of unquestioned American primacy is nearing its end. For many nations watching, the symbolism of Trump's frustration is as important as the reality of India-China ties. It shows that the old guard is rattled. It shows that the world is shifting in ways that cannot be ignored. And it reinforces the idea that no single country, no matter how powerful, can permanently control the course of history. India and China together remind us that new orders are not imposed. They emerge when nations decide to write their own story. And the louder the protests from those who once led unchallenged, the clearer it becomes that their grip is slipping. This is the lesson hidden beneath Trump's anger. It is not about one man's temper or one administration's policy. It is about the dawning realization that the world is moving on. For decades, America was the unquestioned anchor of global affairs. Now, as India and China find ways to cooperate, that anchor is beginning to lift. And when the ground shifts beneath the most powerful, the tremors are felt everywhere. The fear in Washington is not just about what is happening now. It is about what is coming next. A new order is forming, and no amount of anger can stop it. When we look closely at the friendship between India and China, beyond the headlines and the political debates, what stands out most is the lesson it teaches the world about the strength of collaboration. These are two nations with a long history of disputes, with ideological differences, and with border tensions that have defined much of their relationship. And yet, when they choose to stand side by side, even cautiously, they generate a force strong enough to unsettle the most powerful players on the global stage. That in itself is a powerful reminder unity does not erase differences, but it creates a shield of strength that no amount of division can match. In politics, as in life, we often underestimate the transformative impact of cooperation. We glorify competition, we celebrate rivalry, and we assume that progress comes only when one side defeats the other. But India and China, by choosing dialogue over hostility and partnership over isolation in certain areas, reveal a different truth. Cooperation is not weakness, it is strategy. It is a way of multiplying power without multiplying conflict. And the hook here is undeniable. When unity between rivals is possible, it creates a ripple so powerful that even those far removed from the relationship feel its shock. For Donald Trump and others watching from Washington, the discomfort is real. America has long counted on divisions between India and China to maintain influence in Asia. If those divisions soften, even temporarily, the U.S. loses one of its most reliable tools of leverage. That is why Trump's frustration is not simply political, it is personal. It undermines the old assumption that rivals must always remain rivals, and it threatens the comfortable predictability of a world where America could always step in as the deciding factor. In that sense, the partnership between India and China is more than an alliance. It is a disruption to the very logic that has kept certain powers in control. But beyond geopolitics, there is another layer of meaning here. The strength of collaboration teaches every nation, every community, and every individual that progress often comes not from standing apart, but from finding ways to stand together. If two of the largest, most complex, and most competitive nations in the world can identify common ground, then what excuse do others have for clinging to conflict? The truth is that unity magnifies influence, and it terrifies those who benefit from division. And that is the real reason Trump's anger becomes such a powerful symbol. It reveals how fragile dominance becomes in the face of cooperation. The brilliance of collaboration is that it does not demand perfection. India and China will not erase their disagreements overnight. They will still have border disputes, ideological clashes, and moments of tension. But the very act of moving forward despite those obstacles shows resilience. It demonstrates that unity is not about avoiding differences, but about managing them in service of something greater. This is a message that resonates far beyond diplomacy. It is a message for leaders, for communities, and for individuals everywhere. The hook is simple. If two rivals with centuries of history can find space for partnership, then what is truly impossible? What makes this moment even more profound is that unity, in this context, creates a power greater than either nation could command alone. India brings demographic strength, technological innovation, and global soft power rooted in its democracy. China brings industrial dominance, infrastructure mastery, and financial weight. Combined, these strengths create an influence capable of reshaping not just regional dynamics, but global systems. This is what Washington fears the most, that collaboration between two giants can shift the center of gravity in ways no single nation can resist. The lesson becomes clear. Collaboration is not only a diplomatic choice, it is a form of power. It is a tool that magnifies presence, amplifies voice, and strengthens resolve. It is also the one thing that those clinging to old hierarchies cannot control. When unity emerges where division once thrived, the balance of power is rewritten. India and China, in their friendship, remind the world of this truth. The future belongs to those who can cooperate without losing themselves, to those who see strength not in standing alone, but in standing together, and that is why their partnership resonates far beyond borders. It is a reminder that unity is the force that unsettles empires and builds new chapters of history. So as we close, I want you to hold on to this thought. Friendship is power, unity is power, growth is power, and when you dare to embrace it, you will always stir resistance, but you will also inspire respect. India and China together are writing a new chapter, and it is a reminder to every single one of us, never let the fear of others dictate the story of your own becoming. Thank you.